welcome back and this is now the third episode of Jerusalem, the Stone of Stumbling. This time we're going to drill into, I guess, two of my favorite arenas, which is pastoring and apologetics. But John has chops in this arena as well. John Loeffler is back with us. Thank you, John, for continuing this conversation. Let me tee it up like this. In our last episode, you led us into a pretty deep conversation about the narrative, and you talked about how we live in the era of the collapsing narrative. And I kept thinking about another old fable that goes along with this, which is the emperor has no clothes. Mm-hmm. There comes a moment when everybody should realize that the emperor is naked, but they all just decide to go along with the lie. And where this has really begun to hit the fan for me is my young adult kids. I have young adults at home, and what I've observed is that whenever the conversation about Jerusalem and Israel and Hamas comes up, mm-hmm. it reveals a massive dinner table disconnect for me. If my kid's dad and their kids sit at supper and we're talking about the Israel war right now, it's almost impossible for me to shake them out of the narrative of Israel oppressor, Hamas victim, because for them, that's not even a conversation. That's just reality. It's their default setting. And this exists in their minds right alongside their theological beliefs, by which the Bible is the verbally inerrant Word of God, the Lord Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and they would and will say, I agree with Pastor Paul Van Oy of Candlelight, and he's our pastor. But when the topic goes to Israel, there's this Grand Canyon between us because we've got a generation, and based on our conversation, I would put it like this, John. We've got a generation that lacks so much history, that is so devoid of a grasp of the facts on the ground, that not only can they not challenge the narrative, they're not even aware that the narrative exists, and it is a narrative. And so where my mind now goes is, John, should we be talking about this in our youth ministry? Should we be doing youth Bible studies that, while going verse by verse through whatever passage is under discussion, actually drills down deep into the facts relating to, in this case, for example, Jerusalem, the Stone of Stumbling? Is it enough anymore to have young adult ministries that just we serve pizza and then we talk about Jesus and then we pray and then we go home? Or should we be having conversations like this with our young people? What do you think, John?
Got 5 hours?
It's a long conversation, isn't it? And we've had it. We've done some of this.
Yeah, I've been saying this for about 30 years, that I've been a minor critic of verse-by-verse Bible study. And that makes everybody from Candlelight go,
Well, minor critic means you agree with verse by verse.
Right.
But is it doing everything we need to do the way we're doing it?
And let me tell you why. And this has been my observation. And believe it or not, it started with a conversation that Pastor Paul and I had, I think 20 years ago at lunch.
Oh.
Because he began to observe the very thing that you're talking about. There's this breakdown in what we're teaching the youth versus the way they're behaving. Mm-hmm. And he went on for a while, and it just so happened, I'm not saying I'm smarter than Pastor Paul, by the way, but I said, well, Paul, the first thing I do whenever I get done listening to one of your sermons, I ask, so what? Mm-hmm. Okay, if I can't answer that question, you just wasted 45 minutes of my time. And so many of the sermons we hear on Christian radio they can't answer the so what questions. Like, well, that was nice, big good. But he began talking about this breakdown among the youth, and he went on for a while, and he was trying to figure out how to get over this hump. And it just so happened I was working in this area we'd produced a show for Stealing the Mind sometime earlier called The Truth Behind Outcome-Based Education. So I was pretty up on it at the time. And I said, your problem, Paul, is not what you're teaching kids in, especially high school kids. I'm really concerned about the high school kids because this is where the ideas all really gel and come together. It's not what you're teaching them. It's how they are taught to think in the public school system. And it's based on a postmodern premise of no absolute truth. So let me frame it. I think we talked about this once before.
Which, by the way, is a misnomer and a dodge, because the one absolute truth they believe in is that you're supposed to trust them that there's no absolute truth.
Absolute truth, right.
But that's part of the processing.
And that's
right?
the problem, is that you began adding all these quid pro quos and everything. And about 1989, I always benchmark this at the Governor's Conference on Education. Dr. Shirley McCune was the keynote speaker. And if you go back and listen to fragments of that speech, she's telling you there's a sea change in what we're going to teach in education. We're no longer going to teach kids what to think, facts. So facts are out, supposedly, and we're going to teach them how to think. But when they said critical thinking among the educratic elites, they didn't mean let's teach them logical fallacies, logical syllogisms, Venn diagrams, and the things that you or I would take as being classic Western logic so they can process information. What she meant is let's teach them group think. And so the characteristics that all of our young people have been taught for all these years are probably about 4. I usually round it out to about 4. The first thing is it's based on relative ideas, so that there are no absolute truths, even though you and I both know at that moment they have to say there is an absolute truth,
Yes.
that there's no absolute truth. I mean, that's what they have to do.
There's at
right?
least one.
There's at least one, right? So then they start making exceptions over here. So because it's relative, it's constantly changing. And it has to, because the Overton window, as they call it, starts shifting in various directions about what people accept as true or false.
As in last episode, this is where left and right appear the same relative to each other, but the whole thing
But the whole
moves.
window's being moved, and a lot of times people aren't aware of that, that this is the goal of cultural Marxism, is to move the entire window while the two groups are fighting with each other.
Right,
That's
and it's
the dialectic.
it's in the interest of the agenda of these, what did you call them, educrats?
Educrats.
Where the young people, their eyes are perpetually fixed on this Overton window, and they're moving with it, and they've moved. And now in my lifetime, I'm 50 something years old, and in my short lifetime, I've observed a massive shift. My young adults would not call themselves liberals, but by the definitions that I came up with in the 70s and 80s, they're unashamedly, they're ideologically entirely there. But they view themselves as kind of libertarians and centrists. And with this question of Israel, it's just obvious to them. Is the IDF is the oppressor, and Hamas is the oppressed.
Because they have, okay, let's go to the
And
next.
there's no facts. They don't. When you talk to them about facts, it just sounds.
It's a total collectivization, because first of all, it's relative, so it's constantly changing. And here comes the great part. It's self-contradicting. All of these ideas, because there are no absolute truths, remember, they're all floating around out here, and they all start whamming and bamming into each other. Okay, so the only way they can glue that all together, because the postmoderns have been caught, that the emperor has no clothes, they're in serious trouble, and the chaos that's been resulting in our political system and our moral system, in the churches now, as Wocus Pocus has flooded into churches.
Locus pocus.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. It's nothing but smoke and mirrors. And the fourth characteristic, and this is the most important one out of the 4, is that it is consensus driven.
Okay.
It is dictated, and that's where all these
Majority
cliches
vote.
come in. Majority vote, majority ideas. I had an encounter at the gym one day with a gentleman who's a professional bodyguard for politicians when they travel abroad. And so he has to go with these guys, and they, men and women, and say they'll go to he described a situation, a cocktail party. And we go to this cocktail party, and a couple of Arab gentlemen show up, and they're in full formal regalia, like from Saudi Arabia, and they have ceremonial daggers on their belts. Okay, now, certain groups wear ceremonial daggers. Arabs do, Sikhs do as well. It's a monotheistic religion, and the Sikhs will wear ceremonial daggers as part of the retinue. He said, but I have to figure out whether or not these guys are a threat. Are these just ceremonial daggers, or could this become a potential thing that I'm going to have to jump in and intervene? And he's going through the Navy and the military, the Marine OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, how you process this out. He's telling me how he as a bodyguard has to think. And there was a young man standing right next to us listening to the conversation. And finally, he can't deal with it any second longer. And he looks at it and he says, yeah, but isn't that racist? And I looked at him. You should see the expression on his face. I said, who cares? Then his eyes got really big. Okay.
Yeah.
I said, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, are these two Arab gentlemen a threat? That's the question. Who cares if it's a racist question?
That's right.
But see, what he was trying to do was do exactly what you said. They think in cliches and categories. So when you say, well, I'm in favor of, I support Israel. What does support Israel? It means I believe in its right to exist. What does it mean to say when from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? You believe in genocide, and you believe that Israel should be pushed into the sea and the 11 million Jews destroyed, because where are they going to go?
Well, and the way you just closed that loop, the sentence that you just framed is utterly logical. You've just admitted that the slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, means that the Jews have to go into the sea where they will die.
That's correct.
That's literally what the statement is saying in reality. But the slogan in the minds of the postmodern generation cannot mean genocide. In their minds, because it's not a genocidal slogan.
Because it's category. This is what intersectionality is all about.
Yeah, intersectionality. We can't. So, for example, in this exact case, the young people that I'm hearing about and sometimes hearing from and teaching and involved in teaching, this is where they're caught. Is that the slogan? The slogan ends where reality begins.
Correct.
And the thinking stops where that ends.
And they can't deal with that dissonance. They are not trained in how to process.
But the judgment doesn't stop.
That's correct.
They're not thinking, but they're judging based on the slogan out of their disconnect.
That's correct.
And so you, with your friend who is thinking about rules of engagement for guys wearing ceremonial daggers and actually trying to protect somebody, is in the mind of the young person who couldn't contain himself any longer, well, isn't that racist? He's already by default decided that this discussion is racist. And he can't avoid that conclusion. And this is where the young people are.
Correct.
And this is why, look, when that narrative has taken hold, any biblical discussion, whether the biblical discussion is about race, and this is what frustrates me about church and pastors, when the biblical discussion is seeded to be about race, then we're instantly already on a wrong foot. I am now defending myself against the accusation of racism and sort of sponsoring it. I'm sort of tacitly agreeing. I'm legitimizing.
Don't do that.
That's right. We don't do that. We have to step back and reframe the discussion. To me, that's that, and so back to verse by verse. One of the strengths of Candlelight, and this is a strength of Pastor Paul, and it's one of the reasons that I feel at home here, is that Pastor Paul's version of verse by verse is usually set in an apologetics framework, where Pastor Paul is able to ask apologetics questions as he's setting up the verse by verse. And the only challenge I find around here, including the fact that we have 4 services on a Sunday and they're kind of capped at 30 minutes. And Pastor Paul wants to teach on a 55-verse chapter in 4 30-minute chunks in a month. And so you can't do the exegesis and theology and all of the so what, including constantly we're talking about Israel. We've got an Israeli flag in our auditorium next to our platform, and we're going to talk about Israel, and it's going to trigger word, right? It's going to trigger these young people just hearing the terminology. So Pastor Paul does get into the weeds and the details, but it's typically, in my experience, often just enough to send my young people home with the questions and the objections,
right.
And they need more.
And
what they need is not more rehash. They do need more rehashing of the Bible verses, but they need it amidst a thick stew of facts. That's where I'm going with this. Is that
the problem is if you have been taught, remember, the whole thing is consensus driven.
like all this history you've been walking us through,
Right.
it's hard to package this for youth, but it needs to be.
But they need to learn how to deal with facts.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
That's
because
right.
remember, the critical thinking that the public school system took them in starting about 1989 was away from logical, Western oriented critical thought and fact based to group consensus based, which now exists on the basis of a series of categories. And we need to talk about verse by verse, but let's hold that for a sec, because what happens is that they're taught to think in these categories, and they judge everything by the category, not whether it's true or false,
That's right.
or the fact is there. And there's a problem. There's a large amount of depression and suicide among millennials and Gen Zs. Although the Gen
Yeah.
Zs are starting to revolt against the nonsense of the early millennials who are their parents.
Yeah.
They're discovering, wait a minute, there's something fundamentally wrong
Yeah.
between, we've talked about the reality and narrative gap. Okay, there's something fundamentally wrong here.
Well, there's often an easy way to close the gap between reality and narrative. I think it was R.C. Sproul who was on stage and was asked, how do you answer someone who tells you that there's no right and wrong? And this postmodernism. How do you answer a young person who says, well, right and wrong are just, that's just your opinion. The way you answer him is you steal his wallet.
Yes, I've done that.
I mean,
that's exactly
this is what, in my mind,
Right.
this is it's not, it doesn't make this simple, but there's a clarity to reality.
right.
If you can bring reality to the table, then it has a way of forcing the discussion in a different direction than the narrative
Yeah.
was taking it, right?
That's absolutely it. I had some guy tell me a long time ago when I was in college, well, the Ten Commandments are obsolete. And my real temptation was to reach into his back pocket and take
Yes.
his wallet for two reasons. Number one, I'm stealing his money, which all of a sudden it's not obsolete. And
That's
second
right.
of all, I touched his person. I touched his rear end, and well, that's not
Yeah.
acceptable and stuff.
Apparently, there's at least two commands
Exactly.
that are still relevant. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Two commandments that are relevant in the midst of the whole thing,
Yeah.
propriety. So the very people that for years are telling us, don't push your values on everybody else. Remember, postmoderns were telling us this for 20, 30 years. You shouldn't push your values on other people, especially with abortion, for example. Now they flipped, and they want to tell everybody what is appropriate and what is not appropriate.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's what we're stuck in. And
Again, it's the skipping from the slogan to the judging.
Correct.
Without what we would call sound thinking, in which we would take for granted.
Correct. And so that's the problem. That's why the generational gap. I've heard more people who are older than, say, 50. The Overton window moves, and with it moves the age of education, and that is about 50. And I hear them say, I can't talk to my kids. Well, 20 years ago, Pastor Paul and I had this conversation. And it was where I began my critique of verse-by-verse Bible study. Because I told Paul was telling me about the fact that they were trying to teach all of the youth biblical principles for living and morals, etc. And he said, but on Sunday we teach them this, and on Monday there's no difference in their behavior. And I said, well, because what this postmodern thought requires is compartmentalization. Same thing, intersectionality. Intersectionality is just an effort to harmonize all of the inherent self-contradictions and to keep chaos from just erupting.
And compartmentalization amid that chaos means, in Sunday morning in the auditorium of Candlelight, I'm in my Bible category.
Correct.
I'm going to go home and probably not even wait till Monday. Probably by the time lunch is done on Sunday, I'm going to be in my video game category.
Correct.
And I would be the last person.
And don't forget, there's your drug use category, your sex life category, your morality category, your how you get things done category, how you judge the way, all these categories. And there's only one unpardonable sin. Do you know what that one is?
In postmodernism,
In
right?
postmodernism, there's only one, and the unpardonable sin is, and see, you can have contradictions in these categories. The only unpardonable sin is to open a gate between two compartments. It's like, matter and antimatter. And that's streng verboten. You just cannot, you can't.
Well,
do that.
and our Gen Z has been taught by their parents and their grandparents, by millennials and Gen X, and frankly by the baby boom generation, to compartmentalize so that you can actually have a whole family that agrees with what's being taught on Sunday morning. But on Monday morning, we're stepping out of our Bible category and we're
Correct.
stepping into either the sexual intimacy category or the leisure time and what I want to do.
My friends
Yeah,
category
or
or
my
drugs or
friendships or
exactly.
recreational drug use. And so as long as these are separate, then I can actually hold in relatively easy coexistence completely contradictory beliefs.
Correct.
Right? I mean, I can right after agreeing with Pastor Paul over here, then I can engage in a behavior over here that if I could think about it clearly, they would contradict each other. Right. And as you said, the cardinal sin of postmodernism is to connect these dots. They have to stay disconnected so that everything can be in free floating and free form kind of chaos. And then as pastors and as lay leaders and as a broadcaster whose interest is in facts and in education in kind of a broad sense, if we're looking at a generation that is essentially adrift on, it feels to me like, for example, even my own kids, it feels like they're adrift on melting ice floes on a hot ocean of postmodernism. And their island is shrinking. And they're about to go in the drink. And what we want to do is pull them together and get them on some land, get them in some kind of safe harbor.
Yeah.
Sorry, the analogies are weird and they're all over the place, but John, how do we?
I just want you to know that Jason speaks for himself. He does not speak.
Yeah, these.
If you want to be
these
weird, that's
these
your business.
incomprehensible ramblings are only the product of Pastor Jason. Look, how desperate is this situation for young people?
It's very bad now because
you're talking about the disconnect, but the disconnect is you're talking about suicidal ideation. You're talking about drug addiction. You're talking about immorality and the lifelong consequences.
sending naked selfies of yourself to other people and
Yeah.
not understanding the consequences.
Instantly, you're a sex offender for the rest of your life.
Yes.
But you agree with everything you heard on Sunday morning.
In
And
that
yet your
compartment.
life is haywire for the rest of your life over here.
Right.
And this is what we're confronting.
Yeah.
And back to the topic, the stone of stumbling of Israel. Look, you're in a church where we're both going to teach you that the Ten Commandments are still relevant. And one of the reasons we know they're still relevant is that God is still the God of Israel today. And he still owns Jerusalem today.
Right.
And I guess the weave that would tie this all together across the components is not just the Bible, but the capacity to deal with the factual basis for all of the Bible. And it's the processing of facts.
You're talking about the unity of truth.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, see, that's the traditional Western idea that there is a truth. It's not your truth.
Not sure the free-floating chaos of
Correct.
postmodernism.
It's not your truth. It's not my truth. It is true. Now, meaning the facts as it exists out there are true. And then the question is, how close do my ideations come to that truth? And that there's a coherence of truth. So the Bible has to be true not only in the spiritual arena, like Paul says, if Jesus is not risen from the dead, then we are truly the most miserable of all people. Okay, there is a truth laid down there, but also in its historic truth. And on one of these episodes, I brought in a coin, the Judea Capta coin, which was minted by Emperor Vespasian to commemorate the fall of Jerusalem and the seizure of the temple. And I said, this coin too, then you have to, I have a coin there. You see that?
Pretend there's a coin.
Pretend there's a coin there. This coin proves that the Bible is historically accurate, that Jesus' prediction about the destruction of the temple, which he made during the Olivet Discourse, actually happened. That there's a coherence going back. You can see the scientific validity of it. Say, for example,
well, it also contradicts the modern narrative of the occupation of Israel, because Judea, Israel,
is where they get
had to be captured from. It was Jews that were captured. That meaning they were there.
They were there.
Right.
Right. And the word, like the German word for Jew, is Jud. Okay, which comes from what? The Latin word Judea.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Jews were captured from a place that they did not exist in because it was always Palestine. I mean, this is the contradiction between
right.
reality
And before the Romans, about another 100 years later, began calling it Palestina, after the Philistines, okay, it was known as Judea. In the time of Jesus, the Romans would refer to it as Judea.
Well, this is the magic of, one way to put this is this is the magic of historical apologetics among youth. Because what I've already observed is that when a young adult, when a light comes on about a supposedly hitherto obscure fact, but this young person understands that this is a pivotal fact relating to the truth of the Bible, and that clicks into place for them, then what that ends up doing is shoring up their faith down the line over here. If it's true that Jerusalem was always God's, and by the way, we could go all the way back to Melchizedek, king of Salem, where there was a king in Jerusalem who was a Semite, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say,
We're talking about that in devotions this morning. But if the Bible is true about Jerusalem going back to Judea Capta, then it's probably true that Jesus rose from the dead too. That kind of logical connection kicks into place for young people.
right. But
This is the missing piece, is if they can be taught to connect the dots factually, then the whole truth of Scripture begins to come together, because all truth is true if any truth is true. And if all truth is true, then God is true. And this is a weird syllogism, but all of that is inaccessible to a generation for whom all truth is just a matter of opinion. And this is why this kind of conversation has to happen with our youth.
it really does. We have to, and it's literally a deprogramming. We have to deprogram them, because this is what they're trained to think is cult thinking. And they have to be deprogrammed, because their lives, their spiritual welfare, and later on in life, their personal welfare, just take the spiritual dimension out, depends on being able to grapple with reality as it is, especially given what I think are the economic and civil storms that are ahead of us. And cliche thinking just isn't going to cut it.
No.
And so I see them as a generation in very grave danger. And I've worked with generations long before me, going back into the gay 90s of the 1890s, all the way to younger generations, etc. We must teach our children how to think logically and coherently and to process facts. They cannot handle logical contradiction. They cannot handle cognitive dissonance is the word that it's called.
Cognitive dissonance, yes.
And I've watched it happen even with adults here in Candlelight that are inquiring. They have to, everything is a package. You have to agree. They have to agree with everything, or they don't want to be there. And you can tell when you take a person that way to that point, because you get typically one of three reactions. The first reaction is what I call the communing with the spirits. Okay, they just sort of check out of the conversation, just like you can tell immediately the moment you've lost them. The second is the look. It's like that, in that there's cognitive dissonance, but they just don't want to know what to do with it. The third one is always the interesting one, and that's what I call the sputter reaction. They explode in a paroxysm of anger, and they begin spewing cliches for about 2 minutes. You can time it on
Like your
watch.
friend who said, "But isn't this racist?"
But I've seen it even worse, even for people here. That we have people coming into the church and they leave, they walk out. Their answer to cognitive dissonance, rather than processing it, is to unfriend you or to walk out on the situation. Underneath now, the reason we have the suicidal rate is since everything is driven by consensus. A lot of the youth are really asking internally those questions, but they're afraid to express them verbally, because they're afraid of breaking the consensus of their friends, even if they're all thinking the same thing. We need to break this. And that's where you need to operate with the youth today, is start making them reality-oriented, critical, logical thinkers, not consensus, cliche thinkers.
Yeah, agreed. Fantastic. I hope you have been blessed by this conversation. We will continue. Jerusalem Stone of Stumbling, we've completed 3 episodes now, but the conversation about bringing truth home to our youth and other related topics will continue. John Loeffler, thank you for being with us today. My name's Jason, again, one of the pastors at Candlelight, and we have been so grateful to have you join us on this journey. God bless you, and we will see you next time.